2-year-old girl rescues German shepherd stuck in the river. What happened next melted hearts. What if I told you that sometimes the smallest voices speak the loudest truths? This story is about a child who did the unthinkable and changed the lives of everyone around them. A heartwarming, tear-jerking journey that proves love has no limits. Like, share, and subscribe, because this one will stay with you forever. The sky hung low that morning, draped in a thick blanket of gray that seemed to press down on the little riverside town. A sharp wind cut through the air, carrying with it the raw, icy smell of the swollen river. Its waters rushed and churned, the current frothing white as it slammed against the rocks. Somewhere in that chaos came a sound, faint at first, but impossible to ignore, the desperate, ragged bark of a dog fighting against the current. It wasn't the kind of bark you'd hear during a game of fetch. No, this was different. It was the sound of fear. The kind that makes your chest tighten before you even understand why. On the far edge of the grassy bank, where the earth dipped dangerously toward the churning water, stood a tiny figure. Barely more than a toddler, her small boots half swallowed by the mud, a red blanket clutched tightly in her arms as if it were her shield against the cold. The wind toyed with her pigtails, whipping them across her pale cheeks, but her eyes, wide and unblinking, were locked on the chaos in the river. From this distance, she looked impossibly small against the vast, roaring current. Yet something in her stance, a strange mix of fear and fierce determination, held her there, rooted like an oak, as though the earth itself knew she would not turn away. The barking grew louder, then faltered, swallowed by the roar of the river. The little girl's head tilted, listening, searching. Somewhere beneath that gray surface, a life hung by a thread. And though she was far too young to understand the full weight of what was happening, her tiny hands gripped the edge of her blanket tighter, as if bracing herself for what came next. There were no adults nearby. No one to tell her what to do. No one to tell her she couldn't. The wind picked up again, rattling the bare branches overhead, carrying with it the faintest whimper, the sound of hope slipping away. She stepped closer to the edge, the mud squelching under her feet, her little breath forming clouds in the cold air. Somewhere in the town, a clock struck the hour. The sound echoed faintly across the water, but here, in this moment, time itself seemed to pause. The river kept rushing, the wind kept howling, and the little girl simply stood there, frozen in place, staring into the storm. No one could have imagined what would happen next. Not the neighbors who would hear the story later that day. Not the strangers whose hearts it would touch across the world. What she did in the next few minutes would leave an entire community speechless and melt hearts far beyond the quiet banks of this cold, gray river. The town of Willowford wasn't marked on most maps, at least not the kind people carried on their phones these days. It was the sort of place you discovered by accident. A quiet bend in the road, a cluster of weathered houses gathered along a lazy stretch of river. In summer, the water was slow and calm, reflecting the faded red of the old wooden bridge that had stood for nearly a century. Children would ride their bikes across it, the boards creaking under their tires, and old-timers would lean on its rails, swapping stories about the good old days, while watching the sun turn the water to gold. But in winter, the river told a different story. The bridge's cheerful creak was drowned out by the roar of rushing water, swollen from mountain snowmelt, and, on nights like the one before, relentless rain. The locals knew better than to walk too close to its edge when the current turned mean. The river was beautiful, yes, but it demanded respect. Emily, at 2 years old, didn't yet know much about respecting rivers or reading the warning signs of a storm. To her, Willowford was simply home. Her world was a patchwork of small wonders. The bright yellow boots she stomped in every puddle, the swing hanging from the old elm in her backyard, the sound of her mother humming while folding laundry. Every morning, she'd wake before the sun had fully climbed over the hills, padding into the kitchen with her blanket in tow, her cheeks still warm from sleep. She loved animals in a way only the very young and the very old often do, with total, uncomplicated devotion. Birds, rabbits, the stray tabby cat that sometimes perched on the fence, she greeted them all with the same wide-eyed delight. But none held her heart quite like Max, the German shepherd who lived 2 houses down. Max was no ordinary dog. At 6 years old, he carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who knew his place in the world. His coat was a thick, noble mix of black and tan, his eyes a warm amber that seemed to read your thoughts before you spoke them. He belonged to Mr. and Mrs. Henderson, an elderly couple who treated him more like a son than a pet. Every morning, Max would trot beside Mr. Henderson on his walk, tail wagging politely at each passerby. He was the unofficial guardian of Willowford's Main Street, a loyal presence who kept watch over the children playing in the park and the shopkeepers setting out their displays. To Emily, Max was both a playmate and a hero. She'd giggle when he bent his head so she could wrap her arms around his neck, his patient stillness letting her believe she was the one holding him steady. Sometimes, when her mother allowed, she'd toss him small biscuits through the Hendersons' fence, delighted when his ears perked up at the sound of the treat hitting the ground. The day before it happened, Willowford had been wrapped in the kind of rain that seemed to come from every direction at once. The old bridge disappeared into a curtain of water, and the river swelled, churning against its banks. Gutters overflowed, sending little rivers racing along the cobblestone streets. The wind rattled shutters and bent the tall grass by the water's edge until it lay flat. People hurried home early, pulling their collars tight against the downpour. Emily had watched from the living room window, her tiny palms pressed against the glass, tracing the drops as they zigzagged toward the sill. She wasn't afraid of storms, not yet. To her, the world outside was simply exciting, alive with motion. But for the grown-ups of Willowford, the sound of the river that night carried an uneasy undertone. They'd seen it before, how quickly beauty could turn to danger when the rain didn't know when to stop. By morning, the rain had eased, leaving behind a sky the color of pewter and an air so crisp it made your breath puff like smoke. Puddles glistened in the dirt roads, and the river, though slightly lower than the night before, still ran fast and restless. Its surface, normally smooth, was broken by swirls and eddies that spun debris downstream. The old bridge stood firm, but its supports groaned against the force of the water. The Hendersons' yard backed right up to the safer part of the riverbank, where Max liked to patrol. He had a habit of sniffing at the reeds, tail wagging slowly as he surveyed his domain. On most days, Emily would wave to him from her yard, their silent ritual a small thread in the fabric of Willowford life. But today there was no wave. Somewhere, unseen just yet, a chain of events had begun. A squirrel darting too close to the bank, Max's instinct kicking in, the slippery ground betraying his confident stride. And though no one knew it at that moment, the swollen river's restless pull was about to turn an ordinary morning into something that would be remembered for years to come. In just a short while, the people of Willowford would gather on that bank, shaking their heads in disbelief. They would tell the story over steaming mugs of coffee, their voices softening when they reached the part about the little girl in the yellow boots. But for now, the town was quiet. Too quiet. The morning began like so many others in Willowford, a quiet calm after a restless night. The rain had stopped, but the ground still glistened with moisture, soft and unsteady beneath every step. The Hendersons' gate creaked open, and Max trotted out, his thick coat catching glimmers of the pale light breaking through the clouds. Mr. Henderson followed at his usual, unhurried pace, hands tucked into his coat pockets. Max loved these walks. He knew every bend in the path, every tree whose roots curled up from the earth, every smell the river carried on its damp breath. But today, something darted into his world. Sudden, quick, and just out of reach. A squirrel, its tail flaring like a banner, leapt from a low branch onto the ground ahead, freezing for only a second before bounding toward the riverbank. In an instant, Max was after it. His nails scraped against the damp boards of the small dock as he sprang forward, his body low, eyes locked on his target. Mr. Henderson called his name, a sharp note in his voice, but the sound was swallowed by the rush of the river and the pounding in Max's own ears. The squirrel skittered through the reeds, disappearing into the tangle, but Max's momentum carried him farther than he intended. The bank, soft from last night's downpour, gave way beneath his weight. His paws slid forward, mud clinging to his legs, and then, without warning, the ground disappeared entirely. With a sharp yelp, he plunged into the river. The shock of the cold hit him first. The water, swollen and angry, spun him sideways, dragging him downstream before he could find his bearings. His head broke the surface once, twice, his paws thrashing against the current. The river roared in his ears, drowning out every sound except the pounding of his own heart. He tried to angle toward the bank, but the pull was relentless. Every kick met with the strength of 10 hands shoving him back. From her garden, Emily had been watching Max the way she always did, small fingers clutching the picket fence as she peeked through the slats. She saw him chasing something, heard the muffled sound of Mr. Henderson's call, and then nothing but the sharp splash and the sudden, frantic barking. At first, she tilted her head, curious. Max liked the water, didn't he? She'd seen him wade into the shallow end near the dock before. But something was different this time. His barks were short, uneven, more like cries. His body wasn't moving toward shore but away from it, the current pulling him faster and faster. Emily's small brow furrowed. Her mother was inside, folding laundry. The street was empty. The only sound was the rushing water, growing louder in her ears with every step she took toward the gate. Her boots sank into the soft earth, leaving tiny prints that filled almost instantly with water. She pushed the gate open. It squealed in protest, and stepped onto the path that led down toward the river. Each step was a story of sound, the squish of mud beneath her boots, the sharp crack of twigs snapping underfoot, the distant, desperate whine of Max fighting the river. The closer she got, the colder the air felt, as if the river itself was breathing against her cheeks. Max's head bobbed above the surface for a second, his amber eyes wide and wild. Then he disappeared again behind a wave. Emily's little hands balled into fists at her sides, her blanket slipping from her shoulder to the ground. She didn't notice. All she saw was her friend, her hero, struggling, and no one else there to help him. The dock loomed ahead, its planks darkened with rain, its posts slick with moss. The river was louder here, a constant growl that seemed to come from beneath the earth. Emily moved faster, her legs short but determined, until she reached the edge. She set down the only thing she was carrying, a small, bright yellow toy bucket. It had been her companion for digging in the garden, for carrying stones she thought were treasure. Now, without knowing why, she gripped it in both hands like it was the most important thing in the world. The current surged again, carrying Max closer to the dock but not close enough. His legs churned against the pole, his bark hoarse from the strain. The gap between them felt enormous. Emily's heart beat in her ears. The wind tugged at her pigtails, the smell of wet earth and river water filled her nose. She took one tiny step forward, her boots balanced on the edge of the slick wood. The bucket hung from her fingers, swinging slightly. Her eyes locked on Max's, and in that moment, the world around them, the cold, the danger, the emptiness, seemed to fade. It was just her and him. And though she was only 2 years old, Emily's face set with a determination far too big for her small frame. Emily's tiny boots clapped against the wooden planks of the dock, each step leaving faint, wet imprints that quickly darkened and disappeared. The old boards groaned under her weight, their dampness making them slippery, but she didn't slow down. Somewhere deep in her little chest, something stronger than fear was pushing her forward. The simple, unshakable belief that her friend needed her. Max's barking had turned ragged now, more water than sound in his throat. He was close enough that she could see the tremble in his legs each time he fought the current, his ears pinned flat against his head. Every second he drifted, the river tried to claim him. Her eyes darted around, searching for something. Anything. That's when she saw it. A coil of thick rope, rough and frayed at the ends, tied tight around a wooden post. It was old, probably used by the fishermen who sometimes tied their small boats to the dock in calmer seasons. The knot was high, almost at her eye level, but she reached up and tugged. It came loose with a sudden jerk, the fibers scratching against her mittenless hands. The rope was heavy. It dragged against the dock as she pulled it toward the edge, the weight nearly toppling her forward. She didn't know how to throw it the way grown-ups did, but instinct, or maybe just love, guided her. She gripped one end in both hands, the rest pooling at her feet, and leaned as far as she dared without slipping into the river herself. "Max," she called, her voice small but sharp against the roar of the water. His head turned toward her, eyes locking on hers for the briefest heartbeat. She swung her arms forward, the rope tumbling through the air in a crooked arc. It didn't reach him at first. The current caught it, pulling it downstream. She pulled it back, tried again, her little arms shaking from the effort. On the third try, the end splashed just in front of Max's muzzle. Something primal lit in his eyes. With the last of his strength, he lunged forward, jaws snapping shut around the rope. Emily felt the sudden tug ripple through her arms. It almost pulled her off her feet, but she dropped to her knees, bracing herself against the dock. Her small voice rose in panic and urgency all at once. "Hold on, Max." She began to pull. Inch by inch, hand over hand, her body leaning back with each tug, the rope cutting faint red lines into her palms. Her boots dug into the slick boards, slipping now and then, but she didn't stop. The river pulled back like a living thing, fighting her for every inch. Somewhere behind her, the rhythmic sound of footsteps pounded against the dirt path, faster, heavier than a walk. A man's voice cut through the wind. "Hey, what's happening?" It was a jogger, tall and lean, wearing a windbreaker soaked dark from the mist in the air. He reached the dock in seconds, his eyes widening as he took in the sight. The toddler pulling on a rope, the dog thrashing in the water. "Let me help," he shouted, dropping to his knees beside her. Emily didn't let go, not even then. She kept her tiny fists wrapped around the rope as the man took hold above her, the two of them pulling together now. The dock shuddered under their combined effort. Max's body lifted slightly with each tug, his claws scraping at the water's surface, his legs pumping frantically for any purchase. "Come on, boy, come on," the jogger muttered under his breath, teeth clenched against the strain. The moment stretched impossibly long. Emily's arms burned, her breathing quick and shallow. Max's eyes, wide and glassy, never left hers. The sound of the current was deafening, the spray of cold water soaking their faces. Then a final, desperate heave. Max's front paws slammed onto the edge of the dock, claws hooking the wood. The jogger lunged forward, grabbing the scruff of his neck, hauling with all his strength. Emily leaned back so hard she fell onto her bottom, the rope still clenched in her fists. And then, with a wet, heavy thud, Max was on the dock. For a moment, no one moved. Max lay there, chest heaving, water streaming off his fur in rivers of its own. Emily's blanket lay forgotten at the far end of the dock, soaked from the spray. The jogger's hands rested on his knees as he caught his breath, his eyes darting between the little girl and the dog. Then Max lifted his head. His gaze found Emily first. In a slow, almost trembling movement, he dragged himself toward her. She was still sitting, legs folded awkwardly beneath her, rope pooled in her lap. He pressed his wet muzzle against her chest, closing his eyes, the low rumble of a whimper vibrating through him. Emily's small hands came up, one on either side of his face, holding him like a precious thing. She leaned forward, her cheek against his dripping fur. "It's okay now," she whispered, her voice barely more than the wind's sigh. The jogger smiled faintly, shaking his head in disbelief. "You're one brave little girl," he said softly, almost to himself. Max stayed pressed against her for a long moment before shaking his body, sending a spray of cold droplets into the air. Emily squealed at the sudden chill, giggling despite her shivering. It was the sound of relief, of knowing that somehow, against all odds, everything had turned out right. The moment Max was safely on the dock, the jogger turned to check on Emily, but she was already leaning into the dog, her tiny arms wrapped around his neck. The wind had picked up again, brushing cold fingers along the water, and the jogger could see the faint tremble in her little shoulders. "Let's get you warm," he said gently, offering her a hand. Emily stood, still holding the rope like a badge of honor, her eyes darting to make sure Max was right beside her. From the top of the path, a woman's voice, frantic, high, and breaking, pierced the air. "Emily!" Her mother appeared at the edge of the dock, one hand clutching her coat tightly closed, the other reaching out. She scooped Emily up in a rush, clutching her so close the little girl's face disappeared into the folds of her scarf. "Oh, my baby, you scared me half to death," she whispered, her voice shaking. Emily's small hands patted her mother's cheek as if to reassure her. "Max was in the water," she explained solemnly, as though that was all that needed to be said. Max, dripping and panting, moved in close, pressing his head against Emily's dangling boots. His tongue darted out again and again, swiping at her cheek whenever he could reach, his tail swishing with slow, exhausted gratitude. By now, neighbors had begun to appear, drawn by the shouting and the unmistakable sound of the river in turmoil. Mrs. Adler from across the street gasped as she took in the sight. "Lord have mercy, is that Henderson's Max?" The jogger nodded, still catching his breath. "This little one pulled him out. I just helped at the end." Gasps, murmurs, and disbelieving smiles spread among the small crowd. People shook their heads in amazement, their eyes flicking from the towering dog to the tiny girl in her mother's arms. Someone muttered, "2 years old, and braver than most grown men." A moment later, the Hendersons themselves arrived, moving faster than anyone had seen them in years. Mrs. Henderson's hands flew to her mouth when she saw Max. "Oh, my sweet boy," she breathed, her voice breaking. She crouched beside him, her knees pressing into the damp dock, and stroked his wet fur with trembling fingers. Max leaned into her touch but kept his eyes on Emily, as if unwilling to let her out of his sight. Mr. Henderson, normally a man of few words, stepped forward and looked at Emily for a long, silent moment. Then he bent down, his weathered hands resting lightly on her small shoulders. "Young lady," he said, his voice low but full of weight, "you saved my best friend. I can never thank you enough." Emily's gaze shifted to Max, then back to Mr. Henderson. "He's my friend too," she said simply. It was the kind of line that would lodge itself in people's memories, pure, unfiltered truth spoken by someone who had no idea just how powerful her words were. Before long, someone suggested getting them both out of the cold. Emily's mother wrapped her in a thick quilt fetched from a neighbor's porch, the fabric smelling faintly of lavender and wood smoke. Max was led to the Hendersons' yard, where dry towels and a warm blanket awaited him. By afternoon, the story had spread through Willowford like sunlight through leaves. At the corner cafe, customers leaned in over their coffee, recounting the morning's events.
"She's only 2, they kept repeating, shaking their heads with a mix of disbelief and pride. By evening, the small town paper had already written the headline, "Toddler saves beloved dog from river." The article beneath painted the scene in vivid strokes, quoting neighbors, the jogger, and even Mrs. Henderson's tearful gratitude. It spoke of courage, of instinct, of the unspoken bond between humans and animals, the kind of story that would be clipped from the paper and kept on refrigerator doors for years. At home that night, Emily sat on the couch, her yellow bucket beside her, Max's collar resting in her lap while the Hendersons dried and brushed him nearby. Every now and then, Max would pad over and rest his head on her knees, closing his eyes for a moment before returning to his spot. Her mother watched from the doorway, one hand pressed against her heart. She knew this was a story they'd be telling at family gatherings for decades. She also knew that her little girl, still too young to understand the magnitude of what she'd done, had shown a kind of bravery that couldn't be taught. In the days that followed, people stopped by with small gifts, homemade cookies, a new blanket for Emily, a basket of treats for Max. The town had found its bright moment in the middle of a gray winter, and it had come from the smallest of heroes. And for Emily, life soon went back to its gentle rhythm. Mornings in the garden, afternoons with her toys, evenings curled up with her family. But every time she passed the river, she'd stop for just a second, looking out over the water with a quiet, thoughtful expression. Because somewhere in her heart, even at 2 years old, she knew that was the place where she and Max had proved, to everyone else and maybe even to themselves, just how strong the bond between friends could be. A week after the rescue, Willowford's town square came alive in a way it hadn't for months. The winter air still held its edge, but the sun broke through in soft golden patches, warming the cobblestones and casting long shadows of neighbors gathering side by side. A string of colorful bunting stretched between the lampposts, and tables lined with homemade pies, thermoses of cocoa, and little bouquets of winter flowers filled the space. It wasn't an official holiday, but to the people of Willowford, it might as well have been. Word had spread quickly. They were gathering to honor 2 local heroes, Emily, the tiniest rescuer anyone could remember, and Max, the beloved German shepherd who had brought the whole community together in a single, breathless morning. Emily arrived in her mother's arms, bundled in a knitted blue sweater with the hood pulled over her pigtails. Max trotted beside them, freshly brushed and wearing a red ribbon around his neck. The moment they stepped into the square, a cheer went up, not loud and rowdy, but warm and heartfelt, like a welcome home after a long journey. At the center of the crowd, Mayor Collins, a kindly man with silver hair and a voice that carried, bent down so he could look Emily in the eyes. In his hands was a small medal on a ribbon, the kind they usually gave out for school contests or local service awards. "This," he said, slipping it gently over her head, "is for courage far beyond your years." Emily touched the medal lightly, not quite sure what it meant, but smiling all the same. Max leaned in, his nose bumping her side as if to share in the moment. Around them, elderly townsfolk shared their own stories, voices softened by memory. Mrs. Carter, who had lived in Willowford for 82 years, spoke of the collie who had pulled her little brother from a frozen pond when they were children. Mr. Avery, leaning on his cane, remembered the beagle who had stayed by his father's side after an accident in the fields. Each story was met with nods and murmurs, a shared understanding that animals and people had been saving each other for as long as anyone could remember. As the cocoa was poured and pies were cut, the narrator's voice might have woven itself through the air, not to command attention but to guide the feeling. Courage, it would say, doesn't ask for age or size. It doesn't wait for someone to be ready or strong enough. It shows up when the moment calls, whether in the hands of a grown man or the heart of a 2-year-old child. And compassion is timeless. It's as old as the river and as fresh as the first snow of winter. Many of the seniors listening found themselves lost in thought, remembering the warm weight of a dog's head in their lap, the sound of hooves on gravel roads, or the way a barn cat would curl up on their windowsill during a storm. Some blinked away quiet tears, their smiles carrying both the ache of nostalgia and the comfort of having lived those moments. Max, meanwhile, had made his way around the crowd, collecting gentle pats and scratchings behind the ears like a king receiving tributes. But every few minutes, he would turn his head, find Emily in the sea of legs, and trot back to her side. She would giggle each time, leaning against him as though she knew, even if she couldn't yet put it into words, that they were forever linked by what had happened that day. By the end of the afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the square in soft amber light, the event began to wind down. People lingered, not wanting the warmth, both literal and emotional, to fade too quickly. Neighbors hugged, promises were made to visit more often, and the hum of conversation carried on even as tables were cleared. As Emily's mother lifted her into her arms to head home, Max padded close, his fur brushing against her coat. The mayor's metal glinted faintly in the fading light. Somewhere, a church bell rang the hour, its chime echoing down the quiet streets. And maybe, just maybe, those who walked home that evening carried something new with them, the reminder that heroes don't always wear uniforms, and sometimes the bravest hearts beat in the smallest chests. The river looked different now. Its waters, once swollen and wild, slid past in a calm, steady flow, catching the orange-pink reflection of the late-day sky. The air was warmer too, the icy bite replaced by a soft breeze that rustled the reeds along the bank. Emily sat cross-legged on a patch of grass just a few feet from the dock, her little yellow bucket resting beside her. Max lay stretched out next to her, his head resting on his paws, eyes half closed in that contented way dogs have when they feel safe and unneeded anywhere else but here. For a long while, neither of them moved. Emily would pick up a smooth pebble now and then, roll it between her palms, and drop it back into the bucket. Max's ears twitched with every bird call, but he didn't lift his head. It was a quiet companionship, the kind where words aren't necessary because presence says everything. Somewhere in the distance, the town went about its evening. Doors closed softly. Dinner smells drifted on the wind, bread baking, stew simmering, coffee brewing for one last cup before nightfall. But here by the river, time seemed to slow. The narrator's voice would slip in then, gentle and unhurried. Sometimes heroes don't look the way we expect. Sometimes they come with pigtails and tiny shoes, a blanket slipping from their shoulders, and a voice just loud enough to call a friend's name. And sometimes they walk on four legs, their loyalty stronger than the current of any river. Emily reached out, running her fingers through the thick fur on Max's neck. He shifted closer, pressing his side against her knees. The ribbon from the community gathering still hung loosely from his collar, its ends fluttering lightly in the breeze. The sun dipped lower, the light softening into gold, then into the first shades of twilight. Shadows stretched long over the grass. Emily tilted her head back to watch a flock of birds cross the sky, her eyes following them until they disappeared. Max watched her instead, as though making sure she didn't drift too far away, even in thought. The narrator would let the silence breathe for a moment, then return. We live in a world where courage can be easy to miss. It doesn't always shout. More often it whispers. In the quiet decisions, in the instinct to act, in the bond between friends, no matter their size, no matter their age. The camera would pull back slowly, taking in the whole scene. The river, the dock, the two small figures side by side in the fading light. The water shimmered, the grass swayed, and the only movement was the steady rise and fall of Max's breath. Then one last thought, as gentle as the wind off the river. If you've ever known a friend like Max, or felt the bravery of a moment you didn't expect, share it. Tell the world. Because sometimes the smallest stories carry the biggest hearts. A faint swell of soft, uplifting music would carry the moment. The frame would hold for just a few seconds longer before fading to black, the rippling sound of the river lingering like an afterthought. And with that, we conclude another journey. Your thoughts and feedback mean the world to us. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to share it with those who would love it too. Until next time, take care and keep the story alive.